big, big communist.
Oh.
Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Well, that is the purpose of the song, Kay, is to make us feel smart before we do the reading. And today's read is continuing on with Gearld Horne, Counter-Revolution of 1776. There we go. All right. And we are on chapter 8. And if you would like a link to what we're reading yourself, you can always just type !reading into my chat here on Twitch. And that will bring you to a link to the playlist where it is. You'll have to actually look in that folder for the actual work itself. Counter-Revolution 1776 by Gearld Horne. And of course, if you want my past readings, you can find them on my YouTube or here on my Twitch channel as well under the playlists. I have two, but one I haven't kept up on, which is the random replays. The other one I have, which is the reading list, thankfully. Okay, so chapter 8. From Havana to Newport, slavery transformed. Settlers rebel against London. By 1762, London had been at war for 6 years with France, but also Austria and Russia, and had suffered draining losses, worsened by mainlander desertions, mutinies, and general dissent. Though the conflict in North America was, to a certain extent, for their benefit. During this time, Spain had been far from neutral, as its privateers preyed upon vessels sailing from New York to Jamaica in particular. Then Madrid chose to throw in its lot formally with the eventual losers and join the ranks. The moral, political, and economic impact of the resultant fall of Havana in 1762 to British forces was incalculable. It was a mighty blow to Madrid's entire position in the hemisphere, and, for our purposes here, was a major step towards the 1776 revolt. Early in the climactic battle, a British officer noted that those Cubans he was confronted were, quote, mostly mulattoes and Negroes. London had its share too, as did the provinces. Their Earl of Albemarle was, he lamented, in despair because of a perceived deficit in this crucial sphere and emphasized the need to, quote, raise as many Negroes at any price as I cannot do without them, unquote. Left to further deliberation was how to forge cohesion among the diverse combatants. The point was that both sides were enlisting armed Africans, which did not augur well for the mainland policy of intensified racist tyranny. Indeed, it would have been comprehensible if alert pro slavery mainland settlers had been ringing dissonant alarm bells and shouting from the rooftops about this policy of arming Africans as a matter of state policy. Combined with creeping abolitionism in London and growing disgust there with provincial training with the avowed enemies of the crown, these were ominous signals that the colonial status quo was not sustainable. Furthermore, free trade in Africans mandated a deep and liquid market for this valuable commodity, and often meant easing the sale of Africans throughout the Caribbean. This was one way to get rid of troublesome slaves, but those in this category were often in rude good health and robustly creative. So, deporting them to a competitor made little sense at a time of conflict between empires. One way out was to crush an opposing empire, hence the 1762 siege of Havana. Thus, the capture of Havana was greeted rhapsodically by some colonists on the mainland. The capricious harbor of Havana, where the galleons from Portobello and Vera Cruz rendezvous on the return to Spain, was a true El Dorado, thought the militant Boston cleric Joseph Sewall. Other colonists acknowledged that they were aware that this venture was not in their best interest, since they were not necessarily appreciative of the world historical significance of this campaign. Instead, many of them were angry, noticeably, about the major casualties endured. It is estimated that about half of the provincials fell victim to various camps and tropical diseases, and a third of the entire force perished from such causes. The division of the booty was particularly outraging. Not just sharing with Africans, but the lion's share was taken by redcoat officers. For example, a whopping 40% of the 1,000 men who departed Connecticut died, while those who returned to this colony took home about £1 for each private. This paltry sum was doled out, though it was estimated that when Havana was conquered, as much as £10 million in goods and the like were seized, adding to the dissatisfaction that grew further in 1763, when the Crown sought to block colonists from moving further westward. In Pennsylvania, settlers in 1763 launched a paroxysm of terror targeting indigenous, a trend that, according to one observer, evolved to the point leading up to and following 1776, whereby exterminating Indians became an act of patriotism, quote unquote. London's mandates against moving further westward and avoiding yet another conflict with indigenes was ignored flagrantly. Fueling the growing anti-London revolt was the feverish hunger for the land of the indigenous that combined with the rapt desire to enslave Africans to toil on this very same land. Yet, post 1763, London was perceived as a formidable hurdle to this remunerative process. In faraway Michigan, a reason, besides the obvious seizure of land, for this obsessive concern for indigenes was glimpsed. The Hurons were being pressed to deliver up Africans for various misdeeds, with little tangible results. As evidence emerged of deepening collaboration between the two subordinate groups, a tie that regurgitated the dire memories of the Yamasee War decades earlier in Carolina. In the long run, an alliance between these two groups yoked to London could threaten settlers as a whole, as the 1812 War, a few decades later, demonstrated. Thank you, Frank, for that example of white environmental protection. Paroxysm, noun, a sudden outburst of emotion or action, a sudden attack, recurrence, or intensification of disease, a spasm or a fit, a convulsion. Thank you, Comrade Neuroriot. While colonists saw their profit-making thwarted, British royalty and leading officers reaped handsome dividends from the plunder of Cuba. The Earl of Albemarle and Admiral George Pocock took home hundreds of thousands of pounds by themselves. This division incensed provincials, while many Londoners found it hard to understand why the outcome of the 1756 war mandated that Florida would be retained and Cuba returned. From the settler viewpoint, the maddening juxtaposition with the sight of Londoners reaping a beautiful bounty in Cuba, while they were barred from doing the same in the furthest reaches of the mainland. Very much appreciate you doing that, Neuroriot. Salute. Yep, starvation has always been, from when the American Army tried to drive the bison to extinction to starve the First Nations people. Yep, which again, starvation is, a long, old tactic used by genociders. Outraging the colonists further was that after being blocked in what was deemed to be a fair share of the plunder of Cuba, they petitioned for land grants in the territory stretching west from Georgia and the Carolinas. But the Crown balked at what amounted to yet another war against the indigenous. This refusal was yet another step towards 1776 as the settlers ditched the Crown, embraced republicanism, which widened their base of support by retreating from rule by hereditary ascendancy and moving toward rule by race. Then moved aggressively to execute their land grab on territory to be worked by even more captive Africans. In a series of swaps, London returned Cuba, but ousted Madrid from Florida, which had a devastating impact on the fortunes of Africans in the region. When Spaniards departed in 1763, they were joined by numerous indigenes and Africans who wanted no part of the Anglo-American colonialism. Though Negro freedom became a remote possibility in Florida during the following 20 years of British occupation, it is striking that this 14th colony did not revolt successfully in the years following 1776, and this may have been attributable to the lingering legacy of Fort Moss and St. Augustine, and the militant legacy that railed against the pro-slavery project of the rebels. Still, there was discernible tension between the mainland colonies' now free to pursue pro-slavery policies with gusto, and London, which was more susceptible to hemispheric trends that had begun tiptoeing towards the antipode of 1776, 1772, and tentative abolitionism. After all, London had made extensive use of armed Africans during the 1756 and 1763 war, not least during the all-important siege of Havana, and, unlike colonists, did not have to fret about this policy backfiring on the banks of the Thames, in contrast to settlers who were jousting for influence with Africans and the indigenous along the James River and other tributaries. Absolutely, Meg. London had its eye on Cuba for some time, as this strategically sited island commanded the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico and appropriately was shaped like a pistol pointing at the mainland. Havana supplied St. Augustine, which in turn threatened Georgia, Carolina, and points north, and thus was targeted by the Redcoats in years immediately following the Stono Revolt. On the 8th of June 1742, a flotilla left Havana with a sizable complement of armed Africans. According to a witness, quote, the design is to enter the province of Georgia, then proceed to the Carolinas and, quote, destroy whatever they can along the way, with the whole country to be sacked, inflicting a heavy blow on England. There was also continuing concern about Africans in Jamaican deserting and receiving succor in Cuba and London's disadvantage. And as an outgrowth, the Redcoats sought to attract Africans from Cuba, which necessitated pursuing policies that would not necessarily be embraced on the mainland. Throughout the 1740s, Havana remained in the crosshairs, and in response, Spanish Cuba showed no surcease in arming Africans, which left London few choices beyond responding similarly. A problem for London, however, was that colonists often refused to accept the concept of Africans under Spanish jurisdiction being free and not enslaved. That is, if one from this category arrived at a mainland port, he was liable to be enslaved and sold, which was harmful to British-Spanish bilateral relations, not to mention giving these men even more incentive to desire war against the mainland. The broader context was the transition from the Crown's emphasis on the Caribbean colonies to the mainland colonies. But the former were not to be dispensed with until the 20th century, and until that point, London found it difficult to pursue the kind of rigidly racist policies pursued in Georgia northward. Cuba, the largest Caribbean island, by far, exerted magnetic pull on its neighbors, and the Crown found this hard to resist. By 1763, propagandists in London were assessing this context, and there was still no unanimity of opinion as to whether the mainland was more valuable than the Caribbean. To that extent, it became easier to bend to the Havana model. One analyst sought to split the difference and declare that both the mainland and the islands were equally valuable to London. Though it was added purposefully, all possible care should be taken to prevent His Majesty's subjects from purchasing sugar, rum, and particularly molasses in the French islands, by prohibiting their importation into North America. Unquote. When pursued, such an approach was destined to alienate mainland merchants who had profited handsomely over the years from thumbing their noses at such policies. As this analyst saw it, There was a seamless garment that linked Great Britain, Ireland, North America, the West India Islands, and Africa. And this integrated commerce with the slave trade as the essential glue. Was, quote, of greater advantage to this country than all our trades whatsoever, unquote. It was hoped that the war with France would provide the crown with more leverage in obtaining the Africans deemed to be most valuable from the, quote, Gold Coast, Papo, and Ouida, who were most valuable for their laborious cultivation of cane sugar, unquote, since their experience in very barren areas made them ideal and exceedingly capable workers for extremely fertile areas. Besides, this part of West Africa may have contained more gold than Brazil, increasing its value. In 1756, the 1756-1763 war was critical in hammering Paris and Madrid in the region, and if French Hispaniola could be detached from the mainland, this would improve the fortunes of London's sugar colonies. Moreover, with the defeat of Spain in Cuba, London could begin to challenge in the lucrative metal markets, in which Peru and similar colonies had become hegemonic. At this juncture, ever greater victories seemed to loom for the crown, with France and Spain humiliated. Madrid was denuded of about 20% of its entire navy, with its 1762 defeat, undermining its ability to defend Cartagena and points southward. The relative ease with which Havana was taken left little doubt as to which European power was destined for hemispheric, perhaps global hegemony. But a closer look revealed that this immense victory contained the seeds of an immense setback. The British plan to take Havana involved a combined force of 4,000 redcoats and provincials, a regiment of 500 free Negroes, and 2,000 enslaved Africans from Jamaica, and a number of pilots from the Bahamas who were familiar with the north coast of Cuba. One did not have to be a sociologist to envision that it would not be easy to mesh such a force, particularly the provincials, with the Africans. The plan of attack was well considered also. Before the actual assault, London informed Governor William Henry Littleton of Jamaica of the need to recruit, quote, a certain proportion of free Negroes in this expedition, since such would greatly contribute to the success of the enterprise. A considerable number of slaves. Two had been found extremely useful in the late war with Spain, unquote. So Littleton was instructed to rustle up 2,000 slaves at Jamaica for immediate service. Sending them abroad did not seem a better idea than allowing them to create a ruckus at home, particularly considering that as of 1760, Jamaica was, per usual, aflame. Besides, as of June 1762, the Earl of Albemarle was issuing a typical plaint. Quote, I wish the North Americans were arrived, unquote. As the moment approached to storm the beaches of Cuba, the cry rose, quote, the more Negroes we have, the better, as they were much wanted, unquote. Recalled fondly by one leader was the great utility of the slaves to Major General Monckton's army at the reduction of Martinique. I believe he had near 3,000 from His Majesty's Islands, unquote. These Africans from Martinique also proved to be valuable in taking of Havana. The absence of mainlanders was even more inopportune, for at a crucial moment of empires clashing, some of His Majesty's most important subjects were missing in action. Moreover, free Negroes in Jamaica, perhaps smarting from previous mistreatment from the Crown, did not seem enthusiastic about joining this expedition. Perhaps they realized that if captured in battle, they could easily be re-enslaved, or that, by foul means, some who marched beside them under the Union Jack might devise the devious idea of seeking to manacle them. In addition, Jamaican planters were at that point reluctant to commit their most valuable property, fearing losses and inadequate compensation. So, the crown was reduced to heading to Martinique to buy Africans there, which was not the ideal way to build an invading force. When the mainlanders did finally turn up, according to Lieutenant General David Dundas, they were more prone to retreat than advance, were more sickly than most, quote unquote, as they wilted under the summer heat of Cuba. To be fair, the Earl of Albemarle, who may have been more dedicated to this mission than most, confessed in June 1762 that, quote, a hot climate does not agree at any time with my constitution, unquote. So he too was melting in the warmth. There was a perception that Africans fared better than Europeans in warmer weather, an environment that characterized the Caribbean and a good deal of South America. And with that idea in mind, a far-sighted Londoner could easily envision the continued deployment of Africans to wrest territory away from Madrid. In July 1762, redcoats were busily bombarding Havana and its obstinate and gallant defenses. But this burdensome task was complicated by increasing sickness of the troops, the intense heat of the weather, and the approaching rainy season, unquote. This obviated, said the Earl of Albemarle, my being so sanguine as to our future success against the town, particularly as we have no new news of American reinforcement, unquote. After Havana had been conquered, the Earl of Albemarle, now better acquainted with the climate, found it to be certain that the only season in the year for troops to act is from the beginning of November to the later end of March. It was stressed to Admiral Pocock that he should purchase Africans at quote unquote any price and obtain as many Negroes as possible, end quote, which gave automatic leverage to counter parties, Africans not least. Thus, His Majesty's finest officers, in the spring of 1762, were scurrying about the Caribbean, not just to Martinique, but to St. Kitts and to Antigua, too, seeking Africans for an important invasion. A number of them were to be armed. This want of men makes our situation rather ticklish, said one British leader, as at a crucial moment he was reduced to trying to hope for the best. By June 1762, Admiral Pocock was told that quote-unquote armed Negroes under the Union Jack had landed in Cuba, though in disguise. But at that point, the Redcoats realized they may have been outfoxed, for it was then that Admiral Pocock was informed that their foes had seized the opportunity to attack the crown from the north. That is, Spanish and French battleships were spotted near Newfoundland, at a time when protection of this coast was entirely bare from Canada to Florida. This was incomprehensible to General Amherst, since parts of their own dominions are at stake in the Caribbean, though he recognized instinctively that his foes were capable of creating great mischief, quote unquote. Alarmingly, cried Sir Francis Bernard, there is not a man of war north of Virginia. This emergency meant that the Redcoats scrambled to divert forces to the north, possibly jeopardizing the potent Cuban mission. This had to be done, since a report from Halifax revealed that internal enemies, the Indians and the Acadians, were on the march, all of which enhanced the need for more Africans, as it led to searching questions as to why settlers could not protect adequately His Majesty's colonies. Meanwhile, back in Cuba, a spirited defense had been mounted. A detachment of armed Negroes and mulattoes with each corpse, unquote, was spotted under the Spanish flag. Finally, in August 1762, troops from New York arrived in the theater of conflict. The excuse for their tardiness being they had fallen in with the 3 French men of war and some frigates, and suffered a great loss, which would have been much greater had the French acted with vigor and judgment. It was hard to ignore the reality that by the time these mainland Malingeers arrived, Jesus, that word, Malingeers. Malingeers are individuals who feign illness or exaggerate symptoms. There are different types of malingeering. Pretending to have non-existent disorder or illness, purposeful exaggerating of symptoms for an existing disorder, or attributing symptoms to an unrelated cause. There you go. Malingerers. See, because it's Malingerers. It was hard to ignore the reality that by the time these welcome back. But that by the time these mainland Malingerers arrived, Havana grandees were already contemplating the wording of the Articles of Capitulation. Damn, that sentence is... It was hard to ignore the reality that by the time these mainland Malingerers arrived, Havana grandees were already contemplating the wording of the Articles of Capitulation. Provincial tardiness notwithstanding, Havana was taken. It was a quote-unquote glorious conquest, said the be-ribboned Robin Monckton, who was uniquely qualified to make such a pronouncement. It's the best nickname for that Neuroride. I think 6F is the best one. Actually, said another interloculator. Man, Gearld Horne, what are you doing to us today? I'm sorry, I gotta look this one up too. Interlocutor. Interlocutor. A person who takes part in dialogue or conversation. Cool. Wonder if Horne uses all these medical terms intentionally to create subconscious impression of colonialism as a disease. I would not be surprised, yeah. Interlocutor. It was the most glorious stroke that ever was struck by British arms. Jay from Barfcast TV, hello! Quote, the attack was so vigorous and impetuous that the Earl of Albemarle said the enemy was instantaneously driven from the beach. The Spanish endured a considerable loss, he added, with upwards of 3,000 sick and wounded, jammed in the churches and convents, as bodies were being buried hurriedly. Bursting with ambition, he targeted New Orleans next, though he acknowledged, my army is very much reduced, and needed more than a little rest and good food, which he thought will soon recover them. Cuba needed to be properly secured too, which required even more troops. Still, it was unclear when another time would arise when veritable internal forces would be so frantically on the run. and the Earl of Albemarle was paying for blood. Why not take St. Augustine and Pensacola? Quote, I should imagine that a conquest might easily be made, he opined. Opine mentioned. As for the eastern end of Cuba, it was a mere thorn in the side of the Jamaican people that should be removed. Also slated to be removed, he thought, was the Bishop of Cuba, whom he found to be a very dangerous man. Equal parts troublesome and impertinently litigious. Happy to shout out our comrade, fellow retro game enjoyer communist like myself, Jay. Celebrated member of the Juche gang. These were ambitious plans, and if history were a guide, armed Africans would be required, though official London did not seem to contemplate fully the danger of arming Africans to guard a system based on the enslavement of Africans. Perhaps like some analysts in the 21st century, elite Londoners were probably thinking excessively in class and ideological terms, assuming that armed and adequately compensated Africans would not necessarily sympathize with enslaved Africans. The Somerset case was now less than a decade away, and the Earl of Albemarle did not issue an edict freeing the enslaved. What he did do, however, was promulgate a measure bond to irk slave traders and others who were fans of the free trade in Africans. Descending upon Havana were men from the mainland who had shown little compunction about enslaving just about any African within sight. And they may have thought that this island could absorb many more slaves. At that moment, there may have been about 32,000 slaves in Cuba and about 4,000 in Havana. The measure crafted by Earl of Albemarle pandered to this sentiment before adding carefully that in order to, quote, prevent many evils and abuses that would arise from the unrestrained importation of Africans, it is absolutely necessary to limit the number annually to be introduced, unquote. To do otherwise, he said, would be harmful and prejudicial to London's other sugar colonies. Thus, John Kennan was allocated the sole license and liberty of importing Negroes to the island of Cuba, unquote, which shall not exceed 2,000, that is, 1,500 males and 500 females, with imprisonment for those colonists so audacious as to disobey this edict. This may have been seen as a sign of good faith by Africans instrumental in taking Havana, but it was not viewed similarly by many mainland settlers. It was a throwback to an era preceding the rise of the separate and private traders, an enhancement of the crown, and a blow to the proliferating class of merchants. It was a defeat for free trade and the sweet magic of the marketplace it was thought to bring. It was the kind of burdensome regulation and government interference in commerce that was to leave Republicans drunk with rage for years to come. That sweet capitalist invisible magic hand, huh? You're still mad about that shit. Let's be real. You're still mad about that shit. Nevertheless, the Crown had reason to be disappointed with the response of the planter class regionally, whose interests were now being protected by limiting imports of Africans to Cuba, since they either held back on committing the enslaved to battle or charged a pretty penny for their services, or sought to finagle unwarranted compensation in the event of casualties. Mainland settlers were lollygagging and seemed in no hurry to join the fray, and were blocking the integration of Acadians into their community, while some Irish and Scots were deemed to be of questionable reliability. Besides, there had already been loud murmurings about independency in North America. Recruiting armed Africans was, in a sense, the least bad option. Yet, even this seemingly shrewd calculation elided the overriding contradiction. Considerations of class and ideology aside, how long could one depend upon armed Africans to protect a despotism based on battering Africans? For as long as mainlanders were determined to equate African with slave, even well compensated men of ebony would be in jeopardy. The settlers evaded this aching anomaly when, after independence, they moved to open the doors wide to further migration to their shores of Europeans from the Atlantic to the Urals, thereby eluding the religious Cold War, hastening the forging of a truer whiteness, though still marred by a disuniting anti-Catholicism, and a continuously eroding anti-Semitism, and trying to make sure that weapons were kept far distant from the eager arms of Africans. In short, the option that prevailed in the Republic was securing white men in arms to protect a system based on the enslavement of Africans, while expropriating indigenous land. Damn, Gearld Horne hits. By the way, we got a Gearld Horne talk later today, too, so you get a double dose of Horne today, technically. And if you're watching this on YouTube, come join us on the Twitch, and you'll be able to get some of the Horne talk for yourselves along with us. The upshot of the 1763 war was to provide an energy boost for the slave system, which is why there was so much anger on the mainland about London's decision to limit the slave trade to Cuba during its brief rule. Compared to the island, by the 1770s, heavy importations to the mainland meant the market for the enslaved there was, in a sense, gluttoned. This suggested that a bounteous profit could have been made by exporting Africans from the mainland to the island. Thus, shortly after the war ended, a London bureaucrat noticed that, quote, the number of Negroes is constantly increasing in America, particularly since there was more care in breeding them than in taking them to the West Indies, unquote. Their number had doubled in recent years in Rhode Island, while those in New York had grown to about 14,000, and Pennsylvania's was reaching toward 20,000. This bureaucrat concluded that if their growing number was taxed, it would both decrease their growth and encourage the deployment of more European servants. But bureaucratic blather about limiting the number of mainland Africans had been spilling forth for years with little visible impact, which suggested that the Crown was not in touch with reality. Hence, despite this bureaucratic abomination, by the early 1770s, Africans were flooding into the mainland, particularly to Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Part of this trend was a rush to acquire the enslaved in response to the non-importation agreements targeting London. That is, mainland rebels, disgusted with London, not least because of taxes imposed to pay for the cost of the 1756 war, had moved to curb trade with the British Isles, which had the not accidental impact of strengthening mainland merchants and weakening metropolitan competitors. Naturally, after Madrid was ousted from Florida, imports of Africans gyrated upwards, since flight southward was curbed. which should have consolated those colonists upset with the Cuban limitations. But this too brought complications, since this peninsula province was close to the Bahamas, and there were mostly, quote, blacks and quote unquote mulattoes, it was reported in 1768, who possessed a very bold and daring spirit which makes it necessary to have a proper force, that is, a garrison, as soon as possible. The 19th century would reveal that the Bahamas presented a threat to mainland slavery, just as Spanish Florida had earlier. For ineluctably, those Bahamians with arms would include Africans, complicating the existence of slavery there and in Florida. And since Cuba was back in Spanish hands, the opportunity was reignited for Havana to resume its noisome meddling in the internal affairs of British colonies. Africans were continuing to flee from British soil, now the Bahamas to Havana, which, said a leading official, was, quote, very detrimental to His Majesty's subjects here, whose property chiefly consists of their slaves, unquote. A practice worsened by Cuba's claim that sanctuary was provided, quote, under the ridiculous pretense of their becoming Catholic, unquote. Those who had fled, he said, were engaged in turtling and had managed to get within 10 leagues distance from Cuba. Thus, by 1769, the Captain General in Havana was arguing that he had, quote, no authority to deliver up the fugitive Negroes, unquote, of the island, which suggested that the problem of fugitive slaves from Georgia had migrated even more from Florida to Cuba. A further complication was the evident discord that accompanied the British takeover of St. Augustine, where the African presence was easily detectable. Whenever a fire broke out or a robbery occurred, the Negroes were immediately suspected. It did not take long for the British subject to counsel the arrival of more, quote, Germans from the Rhine and Protestants from the southern provinces of France, not to mention migrants from the island of Greece. But would bringing in more nationals from the eternal foe across the channel, in the shaky name of whiteness, actually resolve or exacerbate Britain's underlying security problems? For consistent with past practice, the victory in the war just seemed to be a timeout before the Catholic powers reloaded. Even after Havana had been seized and Spain was reeling, Whitehall, that is to say, official London, continued to warn leaders in Virginia that, quote, the French and Spaniards in Florida and Louisiana have long and too successfully inculcated the idea amongst the Indians that the English entertained a settled design of extirpating the whole Indian race with a view to possess and enjoy their lands, unquote. This was perceptive prediction, as things turned out. But it also outlined neatly how venturesome settlers' dreams were seemingly designed to deliver war. Hey, Red Falcon, welcome in. I'm gonna do that sentence again. This was a perceptive prediction, as things turned out. But it was outlined neatly how venturesome settlers' dreams were seemingly designed to deliver war while draining London's pocketbook. Thousands of miles to the south, Madrid and London clashed over control of what came to be referred as the Falklands by the latter, and the Malvinas by the former. A controversy that stretched into the 21st century. By late 1770, William Bull of South Carolina was being warned that, quote, a declaration of war with Spain was daily expected, unquote, which meant renewal of what it had been thought the war had solved, that is, Madrid's encouragement of slave revolts, along with more frazzled nerves, leading to a hasty and ill-measured decisions by provincials. Spain's aggressiveness, and the supported inability of the war that had concluded in 1763 to resolve matters satisfactorily can be overstated. Fortunately for slave owners, those in Georgia found that the pursuit and return of fugitive slaves was much simpler and easier once London took over Florida. The African population of Georgia was growing steadily, and with it, the inevitable revolt. By 1765, the number of fugitives banded together and withdrew into the swamps along with Savannah River, and at times made marauding forays into the neighboring colonies. A few years later, Africans fresh off the boat from their homeland went on a rampage and slaughtered their overseer in the field, killed 3 more Europeans, and wounded others before being overwhelmed. Confident that capital loss in the form of fleeing Africans would now be curtailed, slaveholders in Georgia went on a frantic buying spree, despite the danger of such a course. The Caribbean was the principal source for those Africans entering by sea via Savannah and Sudbury, a reflection of the re-entrenchment from the region driven in no small part by the seeming inability to suppress Maroons in Jamaica and plotters in Antigua and elsewhere. John Lawrence, member of both prominent Republican and leading slave-dealing family in Carolina, in the late 1760s warned hirelings bringing Africans from Jamaica, quote, "Be very careful to guard against insurrection. Never put your life in their power for a moment, since slaves were antagonists who could never be fully trusted," unquote. This tempestuous, though not inaccurate advice was a reflection of the turmoil brought by steady arrivals from a rebellious region. Thus, the enslaved population increased exponentially, growing from 600 in 1751 to 15,000 in 1775, with the Caribbean being the major source in the early period and Africa in the later. With such an increase arrived at destabilizing delirium, driven by fear of the ultimate intentions of this abused property, frenzy that was hardly assuaged when it appeared that London was moving either towards abolition or towards abolition or conciliating Africans, or both. Strikingly, it was in Jamaica that a trend also arose that was to sweep the mainland. Planters and merchants analogizing their relationship to London as that of slave to master. Astute Londoners came to realize that there was a dialectical connection between the extraordinary brutalizing of Africans by planters and merchants and the concomitant fear that a worse fate would befall these elites. Concomitant. Of course, it didn't copy. Concomitant, naturally accompanying or associated. The astute Londoners came to realize that there was a dialectical connection between the extraordinary brutalizing of Africans by planters and merchants and the concomitant fear that a worse fate would befall these elites. Surely the growing spate of slave conspiracies that accompanied and followed in the 1756 war were designed to provide these entrepreneurs with the indication that their worst phantasms could easily become realities. Apparent overtures by the crown to the Africans did little to dissipate these febrile fears. Yeah, I guess he didn't want to overuse the medical thing. In retrospect, the elite's real trepidations about being overrun by Africans might have driven this fear of their becoming enslaved. A trend that was also evident on the mainland. In the mid 1760s, North American slave dealers began importing Africans from Martinique, despite their widespread reputation for hell raising, causing officialdom to force the return to the island of some of them. One scholar has asserted that this massive influx from the Caribbean changed the culture of the mainland enslaved. If so, it contributed immeasurably to a pre existing combativeness, adding to the colonists' malaise as they faced off with London and its growing abolitionism. The arrival on the mainland of Africans from the Caribbean was even more remarkable, since there was a general and understandable suspicion of Africans arising from this tumultuous region. The high strung dread of slaveholders was not altogether misguided. For example, in what was to become the British colony of Guyana, an Akan leader from West Africa, known simply as Cuffy, led a fierce revolt of 2,500 of the enslaved, who were all armed and, for a while, claimed to have seized power in the 1760s. This rebellion in Berbice, on the northern coast of South America, was thus subject to manipulation by Madrid. Africans visited bloody retribution on the most odious of slaveholders. The most odious, of slaveholders. There were two destructive fires of suspicious origins in Barbados in 1766, in a colony where European settlers were outnumbered by Africans by at least 4 to 1. In Tobago, the years 1770 1774 were each marked by violent slave revolts, with rebels holding out for periods ranging from 11 days to 6 weeks, with 80 Europeans all told being slain. In Dominica, Africans were poisoning Europeans with hugely fatal effects, while in the British Windward Islands, there were numerous instances of Africans slaying their masters with knives and other weapons. By 1773, redcoats were strapped while seeking to overturn a fierce rebellion of the enslaved in the nation that became Belize. Like a firefighter besieged by a corps of energetically dedicated arsonists, redcoats were scurrying from pillar to post in a vain attempt to dampen the flames. While, as some Londoners saw things, mainlanders were busily bringing even more pyromaniacs to town. Uneasiness about the Caribbean meant that some Georgians also established their own transatlantic connections and participated directly in the slave trade, following the war and the years leading up to 1776. Thus, nearly as many enslaved Africans arrived there in 1765 as had reached the colony from overseas during the preceding 15 years. In each of the years stretching from 1770 to 1774, over 1,100 enslaved Africans arrived, with the apex arriving in 1774. It was Georgia that in 1774 opposed initially and adamantly a provision put forward by the rebels in their Continental Congress, establishment of which was a concrete step toward independency, which would have discontinued the slave trade. In coming decades, mainland slave traders were to replace their British counterparts as champions of the slave trade, and thus had a financial incentive to break decisively with the crown. Some Georgians in the days following the colony's establishment in 1733 had warned that allowing the wicked quote-unquote Negro merchants to establish a toehold would turn into a foothold as they used their left in crop production to dominate the entire economy. Predictably, slave dealers leveraged their clever advantages at settlement time following harvest to strengthen their overall position and other commercial endeavors, a trend which was of great moment for the future of the rebels. In neighboring South Carolina, there was so much concern about the mass arrivals of Africans in 1760s that one settler that it would be unwise to continue eliminating the indigenous, since their lands would soon be reoccupied by runaway Africans, who would soon become even more formidable enemies than the indigenes. These Africans, this quote unquote internal enemy, it was emphasized, were daily increasing, and over these we ought to keep a very watchful eye, lest they surprise us, leading to the settlers' common death, quote unquote. Charleston had the largest Negro population of any city on the mainland, constituting about half the city's population by 1765 and 61% of the entire colony. Adding to the flux was the importation of 42,000 Africans between 1760 and 1774. Characteristically, in December 1765, rumors spread through Charleston of an impending revolt of the enslaved. Imports of Africans were especially high in 1765, and there were several encampments of runaways near the Savannah River for those recent arrivals to reside in, if they had the gumption. Hefty rewards for those subversives were offered, with little noticeable impact on their running amok, as they were reported as continuing in their depredations on the inhabitants in that neighborhood with impunity, unquote. Setting fires. A white child was burned to death. Oh no. Stealing firing weapons randomly at settlers, and the like. By one estimate, between 1769 and 1773, the African population of this colony leapt from 80,000 to 110,000, bringing with it difficult adjustments for all. Newly arrived immigrants, journeymen, apprentices, even slave-holding master mechanics were not completely satisfied with a system whereby their livelihood was being challenged and undercut by a flood of slave labor. This cutthroat competition brought unsteady employment for many of them. But this did not necessarily turn them against slavery, as there was an outweighing fear of an actual cutthroat revolt of the enslaved. Instead, it formed a basis for dissatisfaction with London, which was seeking to restrain these same men moving westward. It also brought unity with other elites, who were difficult to cross in any case. There was a similar concern about how slavery was distorting the labor force in Virginia, which did not seem to produce abolitionists either. The leading anti-London rebel, Christopher Gadsden, like Lawrence, his fellow Carolinian, was immersed in the issue of slavery. He was a trailblazer in terms of forging white unity, bonds forged between and among European settlers across class and, at times, ethnic and religious lines, in the face of a Negro majority. It was a variation of the long-standing argument that the actual cutthroat threat from Africans should be sufficient for such unity. That is, that the prospect of slave insurrection should remind the white poor of their presumed identity of interest with their racial brethren, who happened to be filthily wealthy planters and merchants. Gadsden's view was that the elite should at least be seen as fulfilling obligations to those who were less affluent. Without this maneuver, he said, it would be little less than madness to keep importing Africans. Thus, in South Carolina, near the same time, far-reaching apprehension was expressed about the presence of so many Africans, referred to by one observer as, quote, the internal enemy that one day may be the total ruin of the province. His name is Gadstein, yep. Brouhahas about taxes and revolts were spreading in the aftermath of the 1756 war. Only reading Gearld Horne do I get to say brouhahas. Right? Thank you, Horne. Thank you for that. Brouhahas about taxes and revolts were spreading in the aftermath of the 1756 war, indicating that a crisis was morphing into something far more dangerous. In North Carolina, strenuous objection was raised in 1765 to taxes to be imposed upon imported Africans, an impost that helped to ignite revolt. The objectors did not seem to connect the continuing influx of Africans with what was confronted in 1766, a, quote, general insurrection of her Negroes, unquote. As Lord Charles Greville Montague of South Carolina put it, the preceding Christmas of 1765, many of the Africans had fled to the swamps, and he then sensed that a dangerous conspiracy and insurrection was intended. Heedlessly, Africans kept arriving, which, said one Carolinian, must render the settlers less formidable to a foreign or an Indian enemy. By 1767, reports trickled in from one key county about armed runaways raising a ruckus. This man employs a thesaurus like a samurai sword wields a sword. Yeah, and probably does it without even breaking out the thesaurus at this point. Similar apprehensions about revolt had occurred to Virginians, notably when in 1765 legislators found it necessary to pass 5 bills concerning, quote, slaves committing capital crimes and for the most effectual punishing of conspiracies and insurrections of them, unquote. Just before that, an African by the name of Bob was on trial for administering poison to a physician. In 1767, a man described as, quote, a respectable member of the community warned blatantly that enslaving Africans was dangerous, pointing to ongoing insurrections in Jamaica. To imagine, he concluded, that we shall be forever exempted from this calamity is an infatuation as astonishing as it will surely be fatal, unquote. Hey, Princess Chi-Chi, welcome in. Great to see you, comrade. We're inflating our brains with some Gearld Horne at the moment. Get comfy. While we hear cursed things, and also, I mean, we hear some things that are, you know, of a revolt type nature, the good type of revolt. This respectable man, quote unquote, may have been reacting to contemporaneous news from the unbridled isles due south, wherein elites were requesting reinforcements for, quote, protection and security from rebellious and runaway Negroes, end quote, an invasion by foreign enemies in case of war. In 1770, an insurrection was detonated in Hanover County, resulting in a pitched battle between 15 settlers and almost 50 Africans. That same year, there was a huge and raging fire at Shadwell Plantation in this province, thought to be set by the enslaved. Thomas Jefferson's prized violin was barely rescued. Dear God. There was a great increase in the number of Africans in Jefferson's homeland between 1727 and 1769. But after 1772, these numbers began to decline. Most of these Africans were arising from Africa, not the Caribbean. But, as is apparent, this did not seem to suggest that they were less willing to revolt. In Virginia, founding father George Mason echoed this viewpoint, reminding that the primary cause, quote unquote, of the decline of Rome was introduction of a great number of slaves. Subsequently, it was Mason who raised the specter of the reviled. Oliver Cromwell and his insurrections sent to Virginia to arm the enslaved if need be, to restrain the settlers, and the long ago dangerous insurrections of the enslaved in Greece and Sicily. Such sobering sentiment reoccurred on the mainland as settlers began to contemplate the idea that London would arm Africans in order to crush their bubbling revolt. Oh dear, there's a lot of contradictions. It has been acknowledged that in South Carolina, the decision to revolt against London was made simpler by the sentiment that the crown could no longer ensure domestic tranquility and was, in essence, seeking to turn slaves against their low country masters, leaving slaveholders with no choice but to create a new authority, not least to more effectively suppress Africans. The point here is that this feeling was not exclusive to South Carolina alone. For in Boston, there were weighty concerns about Africans too, this time of the armed variety. For the Crown had dispatched Negro troops there at a moment when there was already proliferating bigotry. In 1768, redcoat officers encouraged some of these Africans to attack their masters and, in a final flourish, asserted that, quote, they should be able to drive all of the Liberty Boys to the devil, unquote. Outraged, several Bostonians lodged complaints about a dangerous conspiracy.
Julian, books have stuff recorded down all over the years from people. And if we can
Hey,
find a book
Shortcat.
with someone that had similar problems, just take what they wrote down in the book and make it. Fuck. Sorry, Trina.
I'll
Take
give you
what they
one
wrote
at the
down
end,
and make
but
it
don't
ours.
worry. The whole thing is a quote right now. Just think of this as one big quote. Unsurprisingly, this incident stirred acidulous consternation and caustic concern about London's long-term plans. Unsurprisingly, was the reality that among leading slaveholders and rebels were Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and James Otis. New England had been the epicenter of the slave trade for decades, and it was the region's leading personality, John Adams, who, it was reported, quote, resorted to racism in opposing the Stamp Act of 1765. Not incongruous was the fact that before 1770, the majority of pro-slavery rebuttals, seeking to refute the growing stream of British abolitionist propaganda, emerged from the mainland colonies, particularly those of the North. Hence, when in the post-war era, Massachusetts and other colonies moved to bar the further importation of enslaved Africans into the province. Arguably, this was due to prejudice and unease about the continuing and dangerous presence of this stigmatized group, as much as humanitarianism. In Connecticut, in the early 1770s, attempts were made to limit the presence of enslaved Africans because it was injuriously to the poor and inconvenient, with fines assessed to those who disobeyed. I've just been reading for maybe about an hour now. Inconsistent with Boston, in any case, was the haughty rebuff in 1767 given to a bill shaped by the Quakers introduced in Newcastle, Delaware, designed to ban the further importation of Africans. Rhode Island revealed the Janus Fair approach of the colonies to the slave trade, as voyages from Newport reached their apex in 1772. Yeah. That's what that's what we're taught in school pretty much, hey Bag. As 1776 approached, colonists were torn about slavery and the slave trade. What has been represented subsequently as abolish sentiment was more of a fear about the dangerous presence of so many Africans perceived as agents of various powers and their impact, as Connecticut suggested, on the poor, that is, Europeans with little means of support. On the other hand, slavery was a major source of wealth, and repudiating it meant repudiation of powerful elites, which would be difficult at best. Thus, in the spring of 1772, official Virginia railed against importation of slaves, particularly since, quote, it greatly retards the settlement of the colonies with more useful inhabitants that may in time have the most destructive influence, unquote. This latter point was notably true, but this did not necessarily suggest abolitionist influence, but pointed to a future when the Old Dominion would gain added notoriety as a breeder and exporter of Africans. Colonists were upset with the taxes imposed by London to pay for the costs of colonization and war. Though, as we have seen, objections to the taxes, and by the colonies long preceded by 1763. Understandably, enslaved Africans were a major target of taxation since they were one of the most significant repositories of wealth. Besides, taxation could restrain importation of a force liable to ally with indigenes and foreign invaders alike, to the detriment of settlers. However, such taxes were at times seen as cutting into the profits of powerful slave traders and hampering further economic development, for which slave labor was seen as the ne plus ultra. Thus, His Majesty was told that increased taxes on slaves were a prejudice and obstruction, quote unquote, to commerce, notably discouraging the culture of tobacco and by raising its price to lessen its consumption and consequently the national revenue. Some men in the Rhode Island elite argued passionately that the Sugar Act hindered severely their capacity to engage in slave trading to Africa. Naturally, some men within this elite chose this moment, as they did during the war, to engage in arbitrage, as between this elite and London. This list included Aaron Lopez, a whaler, smuggler, and slave trader in Newport, who capitalized handsomely as a battle raged between conservative anti-London merchants and wealthy landowners on the one hand, and another group of merchants on the other. In 1765, the Sons of Liberty declared a non-importation initiative targeting the receipt of all British goods to protest the Stamp Act, promulgated in London, but this did not deter Lopez and others. Disunity within the elite did not necessarily stultify the secessionist plans. Instead, such fractiousness may have contributed to increased desperation, ill-feeling, and impaired judgment. Meanwhile, in London, colloquies erupted in 1766 concerning the Stamp Act. One lawmaker argued that the price of an effective male slave had fallen from £80 to £50 since this bill was enacted. But this was countered by the allegation that the number of ships heading to Africa had fallen virtually to zero. It was suggested that, quote, not a vessel will go as long as the sugar duty and molasses duty continue. The exportation of lumber and British manufacturers must fall in proportion, unquote. Post-war euphoria had given way to gloom and doom. The torrential, inundation of Africans crashing onto the shores of the mainland, bringing with them more horrid scenes of inhumanity and the reality that Madrid in particular held an advantage over London because of its differing attitude towards the Negro and eagerness to arm him, all served to propel a transformative abolitionist movement. This in turn served to heighten apprehensions on the mainland as to what was London's ultimate intention concerning Africans and settlers. That is, would the former be deployed to impose discipline on the latter? An abrupt turnabout from the tyrannical bigotry and slave labor camps that had become de rigueur. In that context, June 1772 proved to be a watershed, clarifying in the eyes of many settlers that London was moving towards abolition, which could jeopardize fortunes, if not lives, as Africans seeking retribution were unleashed. This was the import of Somerset's case, but likewise the same could be said of Gaspé affair, which took place days before this important ruling was made in London. There had long been an illicit trade carried on in the Narragansett Bay, in Rhode Island, taking note of the trade carried on by some settlers during the war with the French, and as part of the post-war suspension. London placed armed vessels there in 1764, which was not accepted with equanimity by settlers, particularly when the Crown's military began stopping vessels and seizing some as complaints increased. As London saw things, this was all about piracy and illicit dealings. The settlers saw it as an attack upon commerce. A climax was reached on June 10th, 1772, in the wee hours of the morning, when a brig arriving from Africa, the Gasp, entered Newport and was bombarded by officers of the Crown. In response, a mob of about 500 male settlers rioted, burning the British ship. Yet, what seemed to inflame the settlers was not only that the miscreants were to be tried in London, but that the chief witness against them was a Negro, raising unsettling questions about the presumed equality of this mudsail group. The rioters had conscripted Aaron Briggs for their escapade, oblivious to the growing idea that he might have more in common with the Crown than with the settlers. He was to serve as a witness against one of the colony's elite and prominent pro-slavery advocate, John Brown, whose surname was bestowed upon a university in Providence. Quote, "I saw John Brown fire a musket," said Briggs. And, quote, the captain of the schooner immediately fell from the place he was standing, unquote. The proclamation of King George III said the members of the crew of the vessel were, quote, dangerously wounded and barbarously treated, unquote. The Earl of Hillsborough apparently did not grasp the graveness of what his comrade on the scene told him about the Browns, the, quote, principal people of that place, the ringleaders in that piratical proceedings. That is, should they arrest the parties charged by the Negro Aaron, unquote. Briggs described variously as a mulatto lad about 16 years of age. He may have been 18, was at the heart of the dispute that deepened the schism between the Crown and the mainland. These protests to protect slavery seem similar to Israelis protecting the right to bring... Yep, absolutely, Meg. I mean, again, it's all based on the same white colonial hegemonic system. And the US today is still an apartheid system, as I constantly remind people. Speaking from Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson was enraged by, quote, so daring an insult, which was guaranteed to rouse the British Lion, which has been asleep for these 4 or 5 years, unquote. Brown and his companions should be arrested and tried, he concluded. Settlers were equally furious, with one local writer calling himself Americanus, carping about the Star Chamber Inquisition, and adding that to be tried by one's peers is the greatest privilege a subject can wish for. Indeed, it was said, to live a life of slaves is to die by inches. Unquote. The youth, who actually knew something about slavery, Briggs, had been bound as an apprentice at the age of 5 until reaching 24 as a laborer on a farm. He was carrying out a task near the shore when he was beckoned by those who were about to riot. He was given a handspike. The rest were armed with cutlasses and muskets. It was then that he spotted Brown and watched aghast as the attack unfolded. Daniel Horne, who was on the scene when Manhattan went up in flames in 1741, dispatched to educate in Rhode Island, and found himself amidst a similar conflagration. He promptly informed London that the, quote, Negro evidence was at the foundation of this inquiry and had much plausibility, unquote. Worrisome was the state of anarchy that he espied, not only in Rhode Island, but as well in their sister colony, Connecticut. In fact, the Crown knew that this case attracted great attention throughout the English colonies. The House of Burgesses in Virginia was among the official bodies that were up in arms with Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, among those leading the clamor. Interestingly, and in a dramatic illustration of the contrasting dreams of Africans and Europeans on the mainland, Briggs may not have been forcibly drafted, as suggested, but saw rowing to the Gasp and boarding it as a way to escape bondage, just as those who were with him saw attacking the crown as a step towards liberation. Understandably, some analysis have concluded that this inflammatory incident was a crucial moment leading to an enhanced revolt against British rule. London long had been concerned with settlers' commercial activity, notably with France. Then there was the issue of being taken to London to be tried. But the accelerant that made this blaze difficult to contain was the presence of Aaron Briggs as the chief witness, signaling that the Crown was moving in a direction different from the settlers on the touchy subject of Africans, which helped to solidify the gathering notion that London was moving towards having this despised group impose discipline on settlers. The Gaspé, a vessel 68 feet in length, with 8 guns and a crew of about 30, became a tangible symbol of what settlers viewed as oppression. Interestingly, Rhode Island, where the slave trade had reached new heights and where smuggling was probably more developed than in all of North America, reacted most strongly to this incident and, thus, could fairly be considered the actual cradle of revolt against the Crown, more than Boston or Lexington or Massachusetts as a whole. Apparently, His Majesty himself took a personal interest in this case, and he may have been rattled by the fact that the decision was made to try the defendants in London precisely because it was felt that no Rhode Island jury could convict the defendants. It was this incident that led directly to the formation of the Committees of Correspondence and to the Continental Congress. It was the first blow for freedom, prose one historian. Greater perhaps than the more famous Boston Tea Party, which occurred over a year later, as many of those involved in burning the Gaspé later turned out to be important patriots. Unquote. Ezra Stiles, who also became a prominent patriot, confided in his diary that there was nothing more alarming and nothing more contributed to establish a union of confederacy of the colonies than this incident. It was obnoxious, alarming, and arbitrary. He spat out, adding noticeably, as acerbic words about Briggs, quote, the Negro Indian witness, who seemed curiously tutored and instructed, unquote, adding to the perception that Africans were being used to bludgeon colonists. Stiles's ire was a reflection of the growing conflict between the local elite, flush with profits from the slave trade, and the crown. Besides Stiles, Nathanael Greene, regarded as second to George Washington as a rebel military leader, was also involved. This was no scuffy mob that struck what could fairly be called the first sturdy blow for independency, but the local elite. Yet they were backed by others, insofar as the Crown's investigators could find hardly any to testify against them, except, quite tellingly, Briggs. By the fall of 1774, the revolt against British rule was evident, and the attack on the Gaspé was still an issue. A petition from the American General Congress to His Majesty objected to colonists being tried in London for offenses committed in the colonies, which was both a harbinger of the U.S. argument about states' rights vis-a-vis Washington, and an indicator that the productive forces fueled by slavery had grown to such a point in North America that it was viewing itself as a separate jurisdiction. But this petition, driven by the Gaspé, went further in its bill of particulars by questioning Parliament's moves in Quebec in abolishing the English and restoring the French laws, quote unquote, and not cracking down more on the Roman Catholic religion throughout those vast territories that border the westerly and northerly borders of the free Protestant English settlements, unquote. Also questioned was the continuing presence of the British Army in the colonies, and though it was not noted, racial incidents such as those that occurred in Boston in 1768 may have been a factor here too. For in full-throated declamation, the petition thanked the, quote, Creator, since they were born of heirs of freedom, and not in a land of slavery, that is, degraded into a state of servitude, unquote. The more colonies analyzed themselves to slaves, the more they revealed the nature of the society they sought to construct, and how sensitive they were to tampering with its chauvinistic dynamics. The case of the Gaspé, according to one scholar, was a proximate cause that led straight to 1776, in that it led directly to the formation of the intercolonial web of alliances, the activities of which led relentlessly to colonial union and finally to successful collaboration in resisting British rule, unquote. But standing in for Africans as a class, Aaron Briggs veered in a different direction. For just before the Gaspé, Lieutenant Governor William Bull of South Carolina had warned advisedly of the danger of seeming to place Africans, quote, on a footing of equality with their masters, as it might tempt slaves to make resistance and deter masters and managers from inflicting punishment with an exemplary severity, which was so necessary, unquote. Thus contrary to royal humanity, which argued otherwise. Bull demanded that a settler charged with slaying a slave should be spared the death penalty. There was good reason for Briggs to side with London against the settlers, and good reason for the latter to do otherwise. In the siege of Havana, the Crown confronted energized African troops who fought Africans under the Union Jack, as mainland settlers were deserting and mutinying. Allowing these Africans to share in the booty infuriated settlers, a state of mind that was worsened when the slave trade to Cuba was circumscribed and further movement westward in North America was obstructed. Then, to top it off, London sought to impose taxes on slaves and scuttle a profitable smuggling business. which often involved the slave trade. While seemingly, as with their booty decision, booty appearing to equate Africans with settlers in the case of Aaron Briggs, a proposition that still nettled decades later. Hey Rob, welcome. A disproportionate share of the colony's traffic in slaves was borne by Newport ships, and striking at the ocean province could easily be seen as a blow against the entire slave system. Then, in 1770s, as anger at London was rising, the legislature in this maritime colony moved to penalize those who freed their slaves, as if to send a message to burgeoning abolitionist sentiment in London and to a future Aaron Briggs. As the crisis with London accelerated, an opportunity arose for Africans to engage in arbitrage, playing upon the contradictions between the colonizing power and the settlers, just as they had taken advantage in the past of the contradictions between settlers and the Catholic powers. But this proved to be a dangerous ploy when the settlers revolted successfully, driving London from the 13 colonies and leaving the Africans to confront the none too tender mercies of the self-righteous Republicans. Those premonitory settler apprehensions flowing from Rhode Island may have dissipated in the fullness of time, but instead seemed to be realized when in June 1772, as the Gaspé was still being digested, the Crown appeared to be taking a step toward abolition of slavery within the empire, which marked yet another step towards independency of the mainland colonies. And there you have it, everybody. Chapter 8. Next time we read on Tuesday, we're going to be doing Chapter 9, Abolition in London, Somerset's Case, and the North American Aftermath. The second last chapter of this book.
Long live the People's Revolution!
So join us next Tuesday for that read. And again, if you need to catch up to where we are, you can always type reading into chat. Like so. And that will bring you to this folder, which is the recommended reading. And then if you scroll down to the bottom, down here is the link to Counter-Revolution of 1776.
Long live the People's Revolution!
Now for the next work, I'm going to... Hey Manticore, welcome in. For the next read, we're going to be doing Michael Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds. However, that's not available on the link that I can link to you here. So the way that I'm going to link this one is in our Discord. I will upload it to Discord and leave a link to the Discord when we do that.